Welcome to you all. We are now at the next seminar on Public Sociology Live, and today we are very lucky to have with us Karl von Holdt from Johannesburg, South Africa. Karl has had a long history of engagement with the labor movement in South Africa, and as a journalist, as a researcher, and also as a sociologist. At this point in time, I'll tell you a little bit about this slide here in a minute. At this point in time, he actually heads the SWAP, which is now called Society Work and Development Institute. This institute, this organization, goes back to the middle 1980s, when it was at the center of the anti-apartheid struggles, particularly it had a close relationship with the labor movement that was actually sort of stimulating, prompting, and organizing so much of the anti-apartheid struggles. What has happened over time, as you know, the anti-apartheid struggles were successful, and we moved to a post-apartheid regime, and SWAP, which was originally really closely linked to the labor movement, has now had to rethink its mission in the post-apartheid world, and has been much more concerned with how to reconstruct the state, to transform the state, pursuing questions of efficiency and equity, how to actually combine issues of social justice with principles of organizational effectiveness. And it is today that Karl will talk about precisely these sorts of problems. Now, he himself has written I think a fantastic book, one of the best books ever written on a transition, and particularly in the transition in South Africa. It's called Transition from Below. And he talks there in that book about a triple transition. On the one hand, a sort of transition to a post-colonial society, the problem of the racial order and its transformation, a democratic transition, and an economic transition. And this book was based on his own case study research of the steel industry, again, working very closely with the labor movement. And now Karl has had to turn his attention to the state and the possibility of generating a post-apartheid state, whatever that may be, and we will hear a lot about that today, I think. And as he's not only head of this SWAP, but he's also now a member, a representative of Labour on the National Planning Commission, which gives him a very clear oversight of actually what is happening in South Africa today. In this picture here, he actually is there at the front. This is after a very spectacular march that actually brings together, you can see in red, the trade unionists from Nehawu and the professors. This was a march that occurred, bringing people together to demonstrate for the transformation of one of the biggest hospitals in the world, Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. Perhaps we can see the next slide, Jeannie. And this is actually, the previous slide was after the march. This is actually the march itself, which was unique in the sense it brought together so many different stakeholders in the hospital, around the issues of hospital reform, and medical reform, particularly organizational reform. Okay, perhaps we can see, I'll turn to Karl. And there you are, Karl, very good. So let's all welcome Karl von Holdt. Let me just say two words. I've already spoken probably too much, but let me just say a few words. I mean, but what we have been doing so far this semester, we've moved from Nandini Sundar talking about Chhattisgarh in India and the violence that she was sort of surrounded her research. We moved from there to Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who's had a similar situation, but he was moving already more in a more policy direction. And then after Cesar, we had the discussion with CREA from Barcelona, their dialogic method, critical communicative methodology. There they were also concerned with building a dialogic relationship with marginalized communities, again with a vision of actually making policy changes. But I think, and then actually last week we had, of course, Walden Bello, who was very much saw himself in the world of the policy, but he engaged in that policy world largely until very recently as an activist, mobilizing people, for the overthrow of the Marcos regime or against the WTO or the World Bank. And I think what we have today is something slightly different. It is actually a focus on a policy project. And the interesting question I think that we're going to address is, what is the relationship, if we start from a policy project, what is the relationship between the policy research and the public sociology? And perhaps even we may get into a sort of discussion about critical and professional sociology. But what are the tensions and problems of actually being a policy sociologist? And that is what poor Karl is going to tell us about. Okay, Karl, you've got 15 minutes to tell us all the complexities and dilemmas of being a policy sociologist in post-apartheid South Africa.
Right. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, everyone. This is a great opportunity and a completely fascinating experiment that you guys have set up, talking across the world about these sorts of things and getting speakers from across the world. Now, I don't like being called a policy sociologist, Michael.
Okay.
That's a sort of a secondary element of what I'm doing.
Okay.
I see myself, and I'll explain at the end what I think this was about. Really, what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project to transform a very big hospital. As Michael said, it's the biggest hospital apparently in the Southern Hemisphere, Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. And at the same time, I'm going to talk about sociology and about the ways in which Chris Hani Baragwanath, the hospital, is a site of sociology and a site of critical engagement. Can I just check, can you guys hear me properly?
Perfect.
Right. Okay. So, right, as Michael said, 1994 was the moment of democratic breakthrough in South Africa, and the moment to start building a new society out of the legacy of apartheid, the legacy of racial segregation, spatial injustice, enormous inequality, and poverty. Just to talk about the public health sector, it was at the time fragmented by apartheid, by the apartheid state, into racially segregated public healthcare system, with also a growing gap between the public health system, the private health system. These gaps were experienced as black-white differentials, rural-urban differentials, and public-private disparities. Just as an example, in 1986, there were 8.2 hospital beds per 1,000 white people, and 4.2, that's half, 4.2 beds per 1,000 black people. And even in 2000, this is now 6 years after democracy, the difference in infant mortality rates was 49 per 100,000 for whites. 49 infant mortalities per 100,000 for blacks, and only 11 for whites. That just gives you a sense of the way the public health system was skewed. And now right through the transition, public hospitals became increasingly stressed institutions. This was because of the redirection of resources to primary health care and to the poorer provinces. Also fiscal controls, a kind of neoliberal strategy pursued by the new democratic government, as well as weak management systems, the breakdown of authority. Authority under apartheid was very racial, very despotic. With the change from apartheid to democracy, those systems broke down, and people were no longer prepared to work in the old ways. Also, affirmative action, the loss of technical skills, and an increasing racial contestation inside institutions, all of these took a toll on the functioning of public hospitals. So we came into this situation. I was working at the time for NALEDI, the COSATU Policy Institute, COSATU being the big labor federation in South Africa. And the union asked us to assist in the transformation of the hospital. This was Chris Hani Baragwanath, the biggest hospital, as I said, 2,800 beds. It's a kind of ridiculous thing. No hospital should be so big. it makes it very unwieldy and very unmanageable. It's located in Soweto. The patients are mostly black residents of Soweto, as well as from black communities across the country. It was a showcase hospital for the apartheid regime. It demonstrated the availability of very high-tech academic medicine for the black population, but always in an institution which was overcrowded, overstressed, under-resourced, in which actually the quality of healthcare was very questionable. So the union asked us to come in, this was in 2000, and help to turn this hospital into what they called a people's hospital. And what they meant by this was a place that workers, their members, would feel was a place worth working, where the quality of working life was improved. And secondly, a place where the quality of clinical and healthcare services for the community would be something that they could be proud of. So there was this kind of two-pronged approach to what we were asked to do. Now, the place, when we came in and started looking at it, it was really dysfunctional from top to bottom. Routine nursing procedures were no longer followed properly. Data recording was inconsistent. Just to give you an example, when a patient came in and had some procedure or whatever, when they were discharged and left the hospital, they were often told that, given their patient file, and told to go away with it rather than the hospital keeping the file, because it was safer with the patient than it was in the hospital's filing systems. Which just gives you a sense of how routine procedures had broken down in the place. And that applied to infection control procedures. Essential drugs were absent from pharmacies. Linen shortages were endemic, and dirty linen and so on. So there's a whole lot of measures along which this hospital really wasn't working well. Now, we went in and we researched the place, and we engaged a lot in sort of stakeholder alliance building. And we developed out of this an analysis of, I would say, 4 basic problems in the way the institution was organized. Firstly, control was highly centralized. In fact, the hospital management had very little control over the hospital. Most authority and controls resided in the provincial government, in the Department of Health. And this meant that managers were always being second-guessed by bureaucrats far away from the scene of action, and could not really deliver effective health services. Then once one looked inside the hospital, there were the silo structures, what we call the silo structures of management. And essentially what this meant was that all the different disciplines, so to speak, within the hospital were separated from each other and managed in separate silos. So doctors were managed in a clinical silo, nurses who work alongside doctors in the wards and in operating theatres were managed in their own silo, up to nursing management. Cleaners were managed by their own foreman and their own line of control. And so nothing could gel, nothing came together. When you were in a ward where all these people were working on the same ward and essentially around the same problems, they were all managed separately, which made for a kind of fragmentation of the labor process. And then clinical processes were marginalized by administrative goals. So over the years, you could see a process through which the clinicians, the doctors, were sort of gradually disempowered and marginalized from decision-making structures, which were monopolized by administrators who were following administrative rules and essentially had administrative goals to report to. And this led to enormous frustration on the part of the clinicians and the nurses. And finally, there was a lack of investment in management, in skills, in systems, and so on. So our project was really aligned around completely reversing all of this. Decentralization of control to hospital management, and again, within the institution, decentralization down to operating units. In place of the silo structures of management which fragmented control and meant that people worked alongside of each other but not together, we pushed for a structure which integrated management functions into a single line of authority. we put the clinical leadership at the top of this line of accountability. So the chief surgeon was moved from a position of being simply in charge of doctors, in charge of surgeons, to being the head of the division, the surgical division of the hospital, which meant that administrative functions were accountable to the clinician, the guy who actually knew what had to happen, knew what had to be done in terms of clinical care and in terms of patient care. And this was designed to reorientate the way the division worked. Our project was focused in one division of about 800 beds in the hospital. That is the surgical division. And then the resourcing and training of management. So those were the kind of legs on which the project stood. And I think my task this evening is not to go into the details of how we did this and what it meant in terms of the way the hospital was organized. But after 2 years of implementation, this new way of doing things had a remarkable impact. It had improved clinical organization and functioning. It had improved administrative efficiency, improved staff morale and team working, and it had improved patient care. So we, measured against these kind of outcomes, the project was a great success. But there was, right from the beginning, considerable resistance and hostility from within the bureaucracy. And that's from within the Department of Health itself, as well as from certain senior managers in the institution. The CEO supported us, but the other senior administrators resisted everything we did. We tried in various ways to work around this resistance, to try and win people over and so on. But in the end, we failed. And some 3 years after we had really initiated the project under full steam, it was dismantled. And it was quite ruthlessly dismantled. In fact, some of the most impressive people in the project were the nursing sisters. They were incredible in the risks that they took against the authority of the matrons at the top of the hospital, and the kind of commitment with which they took on this new way of functioning, and their enthusiasm and excitement about being able to deliver real patient care was quite palpable. And then when the project was dismantled, as I say, quite brutally, they became the victims of the power of the matrons. Their working lives were made really very, very difficult, and they were sort of, in every meeting in the hospital, they were sort of insulted and snide comments were made about them. It was quite horrible to see this shift from a really empowered a group of nurses to the sense of being really victims of an unjust bureaucracy. So that was the end of the project, and the hospital is back to its old chaotic way of functioning. But we think that the work was a success in the sense that we demonstrated that things can be different and that a different model of functioning could work. So that's really the project around transforming the hospital. But what I want to talk about now is sociology and the role that sociology played in this project and its kind of shifting meanings and forms. So I'm going to start off with Michael's kind of model of public sociology, policy sociology, critical sociology, and professional sociology, and then argue for a kind of a different emphasis within them, a kind of a new inflection of the way one thinks about those sociologies and about their relationships based on this experience. So the project started off when I was at COSATU at the Union Federation, started off as a kind of organic public sociology, to use Michael's term. We worked very closely with the unions. We worked closely with shop stewards, with union members in the workplace. We held the most, fantastic focus groups with cleaners, with nurses, with clerks in the wards, to really try and uncover what the problems were in the institution from their point of view. We also found ourselves working with management. The CEO and a couple of other managers were very interested in what we were doing. Some of the clinicians, the professors, were very interested in what we were trying to do. And we became a kind of interlocutor between these different groups. On the one hand, supporting labor and actually spending a lot of time helping them to understand the more complex problems that were outside of their daily experience, and training them for meetings and to engage with management and to engage with bureaucrats from the department, officials from the department. But at the same time, we were sitting with management and asking. I remember when one of our early meetings with the CEO, he said to us, I'm here as a CEO, but I have absolutely no way of getting this hospital clean. I've got a couple of hundred cleaners in the hospital, but I cannot get the hospital clean. It's like I've got a steering wheel, but it doesn't reach the wheels. And that was his description of the kind of inability to run the hospital. And we had to try and bring these two together. The cleaners with enormous grievances, enormous senses that they were not managed properly and that they were not treated properly, and a CEO who in his words was at his wit's end in trying to get the hospital to be cleaned. Now this whole process, so we spent from 2000 to 2006, that's 6 years. 6 years of grueling slog. I mean, in some ways, well, there were within that, I suppose, there were about 9 months of intensive research. For the rest, it was endless meetings with other unions, with the hospital board, with management, trying to pull together a coalition for change and trying to implement it. And then out of this emerged the model for change that I described earlier. But we needed the resources to implement this. We didn't have, we needed to bring in expertise. We needed new management posts to be created. We needed a lot of resources to get this thing going. So it took the 6 years, and we got promises from the provincial government, but nothing happened. The union would engage with provincial government. We would go along. There'd be efforts to try and get them to commit themselves. And there were commitments, but then they were withdrawn, and there was this kind of paralysis. And then you saw the march. Michael showed you the slides of the march. That was the high point of public sociology in this particular struggle. A new MEC. MEC is a provincial minister of health. So a new MEC was appointed. He spent the first few months in his office not listening to us. And so we organized this march. And on the march we had, as you saw, I think, we had unionists, we had the union, national leadership of the union, we had professors, we had the dean of the health sciences faculty from here at Wits. We had matrons, nurses, cleaners. We had the community. We had the ladies from the Methodist Church whose relation to the hospital was that of visiting on Wednesdays to pray for patients. So we had them all in one march together. And we had some sociologists on the march. I think you saw those in the picture as well. So this was really the high point of this kind of organic sociology, of a kind of movement for change. It was successful. The MEC accepted the petition that we presented to him. And there was then a very high-level meeting between the union and the MEC. And the result of this was that 5 million rand was released to actually resource the project and implement it. So then, in Michael's schema, I became a policy sociologist. I was now paid. I had a client. I had a budget of 5 million rand to manage. And we brought in some fantastic people, some real health system experts on health system IT systems, management expertise in running hospitals, nursing expertise, a whole bunch of really key people who had the expertise that certainly me and our trade unionists, we didn't have this kind of expertise. So we worked on implementing this for 5 years. For 2 years, policy sociologist. And then we started to see that this thing, despite everything that we were achieving and despite the political pressure brought to bear by the union, the bureaucrats that I mentioned, the kind of hostility and indifference, this started to fight back. And we could see it was rolling us back. You could begin to see the writing on the wall, although it took about 2 years before they finally razed this thing to the ground. And so in 2008, before they'd completely dismantled it, I retired to the academy exhausted. That's the Southern Windmill, exhausted. Now I'm in the sphere of professional or critical sociology. And this is a wonderful space to reflect on those things and try and understand. In fact, the slogan that I went back to university with, the slogan that I chose as my banner, the banner for my re-entry into the academic world, was the point is not to change the world, it's to understand it. Because I felt that this whole protracted struggle that I'd been involved in had demonstrated that I didn't fully understand the world. How to understand this, that you profoundly improve the quality of hospital functioning and the experience of patients and of the people who work there, and yet the bureaucracy rolls you over like a steamroller and destroys the whole thing. How to understand this? So I did some thinking, I did some reading, I did some reflection, and I wrote an academic article analyzing the informal rationales within the state. And I hope I'm not running out of time. Well, I've got time. Let me tell you let me tell you about the translation from the experience of policy sociology into critical, I call critical sociology. We often found ourselves sitting in a board meeting on the 11th floor of the hospital, and the CEO and the government officials who were supposed to come to this meeting never came, and we were told they'd gone somewhere else. And we then would sit around and say, what the hell is going on here? And we had a little joke. We said that it seems like the Department of healthcare is actually not its primary concern. Healthcare is actually incidental to its functioning. That was just a joke that we used to tell ourselves in the midst of all of this frustration. When I got into the academy, I thought, hang on a second. This joke actually is quite profound in its implications. And I started to think back and work back through the kind of experiences we had had. And indeed, it was absolutely true that a large part of the functioning of the state institutions had little to do with its purported goals of delivering better health care for the citizens of the country, and lots to do with other things, namely, in this case, with the formation of a new black elite inside the system and the kind of bureaucratic struggles that were fought over this, affirmative action and other means to this end. So I wrote this article, and it was actually quite cathartic in a certain sense for me and for the colleagues that I'd been working with, to be able to name what had been happening and put it into some kind of order, and also to understand it historically, to actually, in a sense, put what we'd experienced as a historical process in terms of the kinds of contestations and struggles of a movement from apartheid to a democratic state, and the way in which the democratic state in many ways inverted practices that had been endemic in the apartheid state, but nonetheless practices that did not deliver to the people. So I published this article, and then it started to circulate within interested circles, within progressive intellectual circles, including a lot of or some of the young intellectuals in the presidency, South Africa's presidency. And key figures within the presidency then became interested in this experience and interested in what I'd been arguing, and approached me and asked me to lead a new research project investigating these dynamics across a set of different institutions in the state. And they put money on the table for this research to be done. So once again, I was a policy sociologist. I was being paid and I had a client. And the paper that you have in front of you is one of the products of that piece of work, which looks on the face of it like a consult, the work of a consultant. Now, so if you look at this, there seems to be a cycle. There's a cycle from an organic public sociology through to policy sociology, through to professional critical sociology, back to policy sociology, and indeed back to public sociology. Michael, how much time have I got?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. Now, when I step back and look at this, these distinctions, public, policy, professional, seem to miss something. And what they seem to miss is that in all of these cases, there was a coherent and a single project. And that was a project orientated around transforming state institutions in a democratic South Africa. So notwithstanding that they took place in different sites with different audiences, there was a single kind of orientation. And it didn't feel to me like when I had that budget of 5 million, I didn't feel like I was now the client of the government and unable to actually push this project which had emerged out of a critical public sociology. So what was common in each of these moments was critical engagement, whether with unions, with management, with the state, or with the discipline of sociology itself. So I want to argue that this kind of project constitutes a kind of critical sociology that engages across a range of different sites, public, policy, and professional. That each of these sites is constituted by a field of power and domination. And what characterizes critical sociology, as distinct from other kinds of sociology, is that in each of these sites, it engages critically with that reality of power and domination. And that is the power of bureaucracy in the one site, the power of prevailing policy discourses in the second, so one's grappling with existing policy discourses, challenging and trying to subvert those, and the power of the sanctified authorities in the discipline in the third. Sociological practice in each of these sites addresses a distinct public with a distinct language, formats, texts, and objects of investigation. In each of these, the sociologist has to conform to distinct codes and expectations, which may themselves set up tensions and contradictions. In that sense, it's not seamless. There are tensions and contradictions between these different sites, if you like, or these different moments. But notwithstanding such contradictions, these different practices in different sites constitute a coherent project of critical sociology. That's what I want to argue tonight. It's my night, your morning. What I'm saying is, so perhaps there's a different way of slicing sociology up. There's a critical sociology, which is a partisan sociology, which takes on the power structures in different sites. And there is another kind of sociology, which in one's more extreme moments, one might call a reactionary sociology, but perhaps in one's more sober moments and one's more collegial moments, one might call an elite sociology, a sociology which is actually quite comfortable with the status quo, but which also has its public, policy, and professional moments. So perhaps 2 sociologies rather than 4.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, so the questions begin. So who would actually like to begin with this reconstructed? Michelle. Go ahead.
The article we read notes that external evaluators of the project basically claim that there wasn't sufficient communication between you and the other white people implementing the project and the Black administrators about their role in the hospital. And especially thinking about what we recently discussed regarding Solar and Fletcher's focus on promoting egalitarian communication. Would you say that efforts for more egalitarian communication may have possibly prevented the project from collapsing?
You know, a lot of that escaped me. Your voice was very, very, very indistinct on this side. I wonder if.
Okay, let me reformulate. We've all got to speak up there. Let me reformulate. Basically, well, I'll repeat the question. Basically, the question is, was it inevitable that the project collapsed? And in particular, would it have been? Was one of the reasons it collapsed was the difficulty in communicating between different groups, and particularly in relationship to race? Did race provide a sort of context of severed communication?
Right. Well, I think, was it inevitable? I think that there is a certain kind of inevitability in it, and that was because I think we had not established that there was a clear advocate or grouping of advocates of the project within the Department of Health. One of the conclusions that we drew after this, and when we talked about it, was that we would not again go into a situation where we knew that the health department was divided, that one element within the health department was saying, go ahead, let's do it, but that the bulk of the health department was indifferent or hostile, and that there were conflicts within the bureaucracy. Because that was really a recipe for, that's what made the process so exhausting, was that we were continuously pushing against the resistance, which was more than we could deal with. And I think that was an error. I mean, consultants, there again, I suppose it's the error of a sociologist, a rampant critical sociologist going perhaps where he shouldn't. Because the consultants will tell you that, never go into a situation unless you've got the full support of the head of whatever of wherever you are. And we did not have the head of the Department of Health behind us. On the question of communication, it's a kind of complex field. The racial issue had to do with our relations with some of the managers, some of the administrators. In relation to the bulk of the hospital is staffed by black nurses, by black cleaners, by black clerks and so on. There was no racial issue there. Where the issue came was with the powers that in a certain sense we were challenging. And they were the ones that tended to say that, these are whites, where are the blacks? I mean, there were a couple of black members of the team, very effective ones that came out of the trade union movement, but it was not enough, in a sense, in terms of the racial discourse. And to understand the impact of that, you would have to go to the academic journal, the critical sociology or professional sociology article that I wrote, which Michael has a copy of, which explores the racialized conflict over the meaning of skill in the post-apartheid state. Because whites, under apartheid, whites claimed to have all the skill and claimed that blacks had no skills, and of course excluded blacks from gaining skills. And so through the transition, one of the challenges that came from new black managers was that we've actually got real skills and whites don't have skills. All they've got skills to do is to implement racism. And so the whole field of skill and power became incredibly racialized and in a very, very complex way. And in a sense that skill becomes increasingly relative. It's no longer clear what skill actually means. And please read that article, because I think it's a very exciting article, actually. But so we were in the middle of that. And in fact, one of the things that our project did, as I said, was that it empowered the clinicians, the professors. Many of the professors are white. I mean, as you know, to be a professor, it's like 20 years of apprenticeship. So we were empowering a kind of cohort of very skilled, very outspoken white professors, which was very challenging for black officials and administrators. So all of these dynamics played a part, but I wouldn't say that they were that there was anything inevitable about failure on that basis. I mean, there were other problems that we had, but I wouldn't say that was inevitable.
Very good. Anybody want to follow up on this question of race, Dominica?
Well, not necessarily race, but I was actually wondering about whether your findings are generalizable. So you said that you've been investigating also other state institutions, and now you mentioned the problem like this conflict over the meaning of skills. So is this something that is generally a problem in the post-apartheid state? Is this also for other institutions?
Yes, it's certainly a problem across the state, and that's what I found so intriguing about presenting the kind of analysis that we developed, is that you will find people from right across different institutions saying this is recognizable, this names what we've been experiencing. So there is, those broad features are something that really do characterize the post-apartheid state and post-apartheid society more broadly as well, a kind of contestation over the meaning of skill and over power. But in terms of the particular model that we were implementing at Barra, I mean, part of your question, I think, is to what extent was that generalizable? And our view was that it certainly was generalizable, is generalizable across hospitals. We've done work in a variety of different hospitals, and the same problems are there. In fact, we think that it could be applied to a rethinking of the entire health system and how, for example, clinics and district hospitals fit in relation to tertiary hospitals and academic hospitals. And more broadly, I think there are lessons that can be taken, but part of the paper that you've got is really about the specificity of the health sector as well. And something that I learned from this is the ways in which that different state, there's no such thing as a kind of generic Weberian state institution. If you're talking about the police, or if you're talking about schools, or you're talking about hospitals, or you're talking about the Department of Home Affairs, they all have different labor processes and different combinations of routine work and discretionary work. And the way you reorganize institutions, it seems to me, has to really take into account where the high-level discretionary skills are and where the routine skills are. So a hospital, or the health system, is quite specific in this sense that the most skilled people are at the work face, operating on patients and dealing with patients every day. Whereas if you think about a more clerical department, Home Affairs, the lowest level of skills is often interacting with the public, and your highly skilled people are in the IT department or somewhere else. So you would have to think about restructuring those institutions in quite different ways.
Yes, all right. So, yes, Raymond, do you want to go next? You can speak.
Yeah, so I had a question. So just based on hearing you talk about the effectiveness of the march and other these really grassroots, community-based efforts, and just seeing a lot of fruit coming from these particular efforts, what do you theorize could be some ways that maybe some further interaction with publics could have possibly allowed this to succeed, or maybe what is the role of the public beyond the initial building of awareness and to move forward?
So, question.
I lost you a little bit there. The last bit I lost? Can I have it?
Yeah. Karl, the question is, in what ways, I mean, what you say is that the march was really crucial in actually getting that funding from the MEC. I mean, can one generalize from that to say that that deeper public involvement actually is quite crucial to the transformation of the state? And might that public involvement take on different forms? You talk about a march, but there may be other ways too.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think that, again, a lesson to be learned from this, and this is a kind of lesson of critical reflection on the way we worked, is that once we got into the nitty-gritties of implementing this thing, this very complex and quite fascinating process of institutional change, we lost touch, if you like, with that base. And I think that we could have achieved more. I mean, it would have been fantastic if we could have built more community groups around supporting the transformation. If we'd managed to do that, if we'd managed to really build on the march and establish a more enduring kind of involvement by the community as well as by the unions, it might have been more difficult for the authorities to roll the thing back. So there was a way in which we did actually, and I suppose this is, I mean, we talk about the contradictions and tensions between these things. In terms of the kind of policy sociology dimension of this, once you get into the innards of this institution and try and work on it, it's quite easy to lose sight of these other tasks that also need to be taken care of at the same time. And this is also part of being simply too stretched, is that on the one hand, you're fighting a kind of battle against the administration, which at every step slows you down and sort of doesn't deliver what you need in order to get the system going. On the other, you're working on this a very exciting internal process in the surgical division where changes are happening, but every change has now requires 5 new things to be done. And then you've got the broader constituency that you should be working with. I mean, that would definitely be a lesson, is that we should have found a way to maintain that momentum and keep that going, because as it turned out, really, we would call the union every time we had a problem and say, look, the MEC isn't, there's a problem here or there, and they would come in and they would put pressure. But that's not a good way to work. So definitely, I think you've put your finger onto something that is really very, very important. If you're talking about operating in a field of forces and domination, then you have to have a countervailing force to support what you're doing. So yes, I mean, in a way, I think we got lost in the intricacies of a kind of policy sociology at that point.
Good. Marija.
So one of the things I was wondering was...
Try and speak up as best you can.
Sure.
Speak to the ceiling.
One of the things I was wondering is, do you think that the racial issues you encountered with the senior managers was truly kind of a racial issue, or is it more an expression of power? Was it like kind of a way to maintain their state of entrenched power?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's difficult to separate the two, because power is so racialized in our context. So it's not as if you can easily distinguish between power as such and a racial dimension. And one really has to understand the history of these hospitals and how under apartheid the administrator, effectively the CEO of the hospital, would be a white Afrikaner guy whose job was to maintain control of this institution and a white control in the interest of the apartheid state, and really crush any kind of resistance that took place. And he was surrounded by a whole lot of other administrators with the same kind of role. The nurses, for example, I mean, the huge majority of nurses were black, but up until the very last years of apartheid, the top hierarchy of matrons that ran the hospital were white. So power was always racial, and it's entirely to be expected that when you move through a transition and you move into post-apartheid South Africa, power continues to be racial. It continues to take that form, and there's a kind of an ongoing struggle over the racial kind of shape of that power. So I'm entirely sympathetic to the racial dimension of that struggle around power. I don't think one can simply put race on one side and say it's only a question of power or some neutral sense of skill. But having said that, I do think that our adversaries in this situation were using race in quite an opportunistic way to undermine what we were doing.
I guess I think you talked in your article. You talked about how you try to work in some ways outside the bureaucracy, like through trade unions, through the research institute, to try to implement change. But it didn't seem to work in your case. Do you think that it's possible to then? Would it have been possible to work from the inside, given these structures racialized?
Yeah, I mean, that is it's a difficult question, because it was our power base outside of the institution that gave us the muscle to force change as far as we did. But at the same time, that became the stumbling block to institutionalizing that change, because we were seen as being too close to unions, too independent, too critical of the prevailing way of doing things. And there, wearing the public sociology hat, I would go out and I would talk about the failures of the health department. In fact, I remember having a discussion. It's a very interesting question. I remember having a discussion with the CEO at the time, who was very much on our side. And I said, I've been invited to speak at this particular forum. It was a provincial forum of officials in the state. It was an annual event with the unions there and so on, to try and mobilize state institutions around change. And I spoke about the project. And he said to me, I asked him, I said, do you think it's wise for me to go there and speak frankly about our critique of the system and how the project wants to change things? And he said, yes, you have to do that because you're putting pressure on them, and that's what's getting them to, that's what's forcing them to support, however reluctantly, this change project. So there was that kind of, and I recall as well the quite remarkable consultant who was the head of our consulting team, who had years and years of experience of running hospitals, building hospitals, running health systems, and was really committed to the public health system. And he was a white guy, and he said to me, he loves this project because the unions give him an independent base. And if he had to account and be working as for a client in the form of the Department of Health, in the classical kind of client relationship, he wouldn't be able to achieve anything. But having this independent base is what gave him the ability to operate in a way that was really critical of the existing way things were done. So it gave us that kind of power base. But we had insufficient allies right inside and at senior levels inside the department, and that's really where the weakness came. Our allies, we thought at one point that we did have an ally, but she wasn't senior enough, and then she was shafted. So, one by one they were picked off, and we were left exposed.
Okay, Lali.
Yeah, actually, all that you just laid out for us, Dr. von Holdt, that actually leads me to the question of, it seems in a way so not easy, but I mean you've just given us this alternative way of thinking about doing sociology, and that as opposed to thinking of discrete, public, professional, to think about critical sociology as engaging critically with different publics, a policy public, a professional public, a public, and that sounds wonderful, but it seems like it would be such a messy, tension-filled, problematic thing to do. And as I'm listening to what you're talking about, it's making me think that if all those forms of engagement are involved in any one project, not only, what it means to critically engage with a public versus policy people is very different, but also anytime we produce knowledge, there's an accountability to someone or something. So when you have a certain kind, you're producing knowledge with the public, and they have certain expectations of that, and accountability to policy world and accountability to the professional world. How do you really negotiate and balance all those things so that they don't kind of blow up in your face, so that you're betraying your publics when you're speaking to policy people and vice versa?
Yes, that's a difficult one, because I suppose, it goes to the heart of the complexity of a project like this. And I suppose it's quite telling that in the first phase of what I call organic public sociology, and then the shift into policy sociology with this 5 million to spend, right through that I was actually based at the COSATU Policy Institute. And so that doesn't have a scholarly mandate at all. Its mandate is to work with COSATU and its affiliates on various projects. So that's what I was doing, and it was a more than a full-time kind of project, and it was a completely exhausting one, also emotionally, because this intractable struggle with the bureaucracy really wore one down as year rolled over into year. And then, when I shifted to the academy, and I got the space to do, more professional sociological work, and that's entailed quite a degree of disengagement from the practical involvement. So I suppose the answer would have to be that to run this kind of project across, these three different moments of sociology, if you like, should not perhaps be thought of as one person playing all these roles. You can think of a team. You can think in some senses of a division of labor, You know, I could, for example, from the academy, be involved with a team working on hospital change, but in a much less involved, less direct way. I would not be able to run a research institute at the university and try and run a transformation project the way I did there. It's not feasible. I can't imagine it ever being done. But I could be part of that. I could be an advisor on that team, for example, from the experience that I've gained. So I think that one would have to see it as being, you know, and there are plenty of what I've called critical sociologists who spend 95% of their time in the university, and then they teach students, and that's about the limits of the kind of public engagement that they have. But students or others can then take up what they're saying quite broadly and try and implement it in projects. So I suppose one would have to explore that idea, whether it's possible to conceive of a sociological project like this as being one that is spread over these sites and that involves more than one person. I mean, I don't know. Maybe then trying to see it as a kind of a single project breaks down. You know, maybe it's not coherent. Maybe it's just that maybe I'm trying to generalize too much from my own particular experience, which does run across these three. And I mean, it's a kind of a curse, is that, you know, you can run a project in a hospital and everyone says, you know, this is what you've got to do. And everyone was very angry when I left to go to the university. But I love being in the university, that's the complexity. So perhaps that's not replicable, and perhaps I mean, we'd have to test this argument quite a lot further. I'll have to think about it a lot more.
Well, you've got plenty of chance to do that, Karl. Now you're running this institute, right? Yes. We're running out of time, but perhaps one last question somebody asked. We got two, so we'll have to ask two. Okay, Andrew and then Daveen.
Hi. So I had a question about your ideas of sociology in general. And so you talk a lot about moving between different sociologies, like from public to policy.
Just speak up a bit, won't you? Sorry.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about moving between different sociologies, such as from public to policy, and I was wondering if anything was lost from moving specifically from public sociology to policy sociology, or even professional sociology.
Yes, I think every move entails a loss as well as a gain. It's not possible to have one without the other. So, I mean, I think your colleague, your colleague next to you asked that question about. No, it was one of the others. Sorry, someone else asked the question about the march and sustaining that. So, I think in a certain sense, the shift to policy sociology entailed a loss of that organic link. Which was a real loss and impacted on the project. But then and likewise, when you move into the professional sociological realm, I think I mean, my colleagues down in the hospital would certainly say there was a loss for them, in that I wasn't available in the same way as I had been when I was out in the field with them. But then again, the work that let me go back one step. I'm going to answer this in a little bit more extended fashion. So
not too extended, please, Karl.
Okay, the move into policy sociology at the same time was a gain. I don't think you can engage with transformation in a post-struggle society like ours without a policy sociology moment. That policy is absolutely necessary in terms of implementation, in terms of changing things concretely. So then the shift into professional sociology, well, there's a certain kind of a loss, but at the same time, the insights that are developed out of that, in turn, could be used in rethinking what we'd experienced, and perhaps in developing a more powerful public sociological approach or policy sociological approach in future. So I think that while there are losses, they also feed into each other, feed off and feed into each other in ways that are really, really interesting. And for me, those are the moments of real insight in the project, is when you're moving between these sociologies and strange things happen. A joke in the public sociology moment becomes a deep insight in the professional sociology moment.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Antagonistic interdependence. Right. Very good. Stavine, do you want to go with the last question?
Sure.
Speak up if you can.
So, from your experience working in all the different spheres of doing a project and dealing with bureaucracy and dealing with different issues around communication and power, what suggestions do you have for future sociologists or public sociologists who want to engage with transforming institutions?
Well, that's a difficult one because I suppose one's so immersed in a particular national reality. But I would say that what I learned is how complex the institution is and how political it is and how complex, the field that one's operating in is enormously differentiated and complex. And if you misread it, you get into serious trouble. As I think we misread it, in the sense we set ourselves up as, in some respects, as oppositional to, and this was maybe because we were linked to Labour, as oppositional to the department. And the end of the project showed that was the limit of how far you could go if you did that. At the end of the day, the bureaucracy is going to beat you if you're going to go into opposition like that, because it has inertia on its side. And we have only our small kind of collective energy to try and transform things. So it's that reading of the field, reading of the different discourses, the different interests, how you build coalitions. I thought we did pretty well in building coalitions, but we didn't do well enough.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things I think that I would say is that you really need to understand. If I talked about the field as a field of power and a field of domination, I think we did insufficient work on the dominators. We insufficiently understood those people, both individually and collectively, who were our opposites. I mean, I suppose the ones that we had to work with, but we were working against. And I would say that analysis was perhaps lacking and led us, in the end, into a cul-de-sac.
Well, unfortunately, we have to end there, but we've really learned an enormous amount here. We've learned what it means to be a windmill in the South. Yeah, that's one thing we've learned. The other thing, I suppose, what is interesting is that the struggle against apartheid was child's play compared with rebuilding a post-apartheid order. And that basically the struggles against apartheid probably didn't prepare you and others really to engage with this whole transformative project. So I think this has really been a very, very fascinating discussion with lessons for everybody. Before we finally thank you, let me say that next week I will be with Sari Hanafi in Beirut, and students will be here with Lale, and we will be having one of these transcontinental discussion seminars. And Sari Hanafi will be talking about his work in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Again, a rather complex field of power that he got involved in. Okay, well, look, Karl, this was fantastic. Thank you very much for postponing your supper and for staying in the university late at night and for talking to us today. So thanks very much indeed. Thank you.